All right, we are reading Nate Saint on a Wing and a Prayer by Janet and Geoff Benge. We are in chapter 14. It's titled From the Silent Jungle. On Friday morning, Pete Fleming and Nate touched down on Palm Beach at 9 a.m., just in time to join Jim, Roger, and Ed for oatmeal, which was bubbling away in a pot over the fire, while Roger mixed up powdered milk to pour on it. Nate had already had one breakfast at Arahuno, but he was always ready to eat another. After breakfast, the men took their stations for the morning. Nate thought it was a strange sight as he cleaned up after breakfast. 3 American men were standing a few hundred yards apart, knee-deep in a muddy river, yelling phrases in the Aka language. To cover as much jungle as possible with their yelling, Ed stood at the top end of the beach. Roger was near the center of it, and Jim Elliott was as far downstream as was safe. "We like you. We want to be your friends. We want to come near you," rang through the jungle as the 3 of them yelled as loud as they could. They had yelled the phrases so often over the past few days that they'd almost forgotten why they were doing it. As they took a breath between yells, from the silent jungle, leaves rustled. All eyes turned in the direction of the sound. Out from the thick vegetation stepped 2 Aka women, one who looked about 16 years old and the other who looked old enough to be her mother. They were both naked except for a few strands of string around their waists and huge balsa wood plugs in the lobes of their ears. The missionaries stood motionless. They were so excited some Akas had finally arrived at their camp they almost forgot what to do next. Suddenly, they remembered. In unison, the 3 men yelled, "Poinani! You're here!" the Aka way of welcoming one another. The 2 Aka women looked unsure of what to do next, so Jim Elliott waded cautiously across the river to them. He took both their hands and motioned them toward the campsite. They allowed themselves to be led. So far, so good, Nate thought as he slowly reached into his backpack and pulled out a camera. Once the Aka women had crossed the river, they seemed to relax. They squatted by the fire, and Ed offered them some lemonade. They drank it with enthusiasm. When they had finished drinking, a small, muscular Aka warrior appeared on the other side of the river. He waded across and joined the 2 women by the campfire. The missionaries eagerly welcomed him, and soon the 3 Akas were taking turns talking as fast as they could. They didn't appear to notice that the missionaries could understand only 1 word in 100 if they were lucky. The question of what to do next was answered by George, the nickname the missionaries gave the Aka warrior. George trotted over to the airplane and began to climb in. His message was loud and clear. "Take me for a ride." Nate laughed. "That's what George wants, and that's what George will get," he said as he walked over to the plane. They found a spare shirt of Pete's and buttoned it on George, since it would be a lot cooler in the air with no doors on the plane. George was quite a sight to see, sitting in the front seat of the Piper. As the plane lifted off Palm Beach, George started yelling, and he yelled all the way to the Aka settlement. When he saw his village from the air, he yelled even louder, and then collapsed into laughter when he saw the look of shock on the faces of his relatives below. Nate could not begin to imagine what the Akas on the ground were thinking. George, who had no idea of the danger of an airplane, tried to crawl out onto the wing strut so the Akas below could see him. Nate was glad they'd put a shirt on him, as it provided something to grab onto to pull George back into the plane. When they got back to Palm Beach, George had a long talk with the women, and there was a lot of giggling. Delilah, as they dubbed the younger woman, and the older Aka woman showed George what they'd been up to as well. They offered him a hamburger, complete with ketchup, which he ate gladly. Then they handed him Ed's Time magazine. George stared at it for some time, though he had no idea of written language, photographs, or current events. The men passed the rest of the afternoon watching the reaction of the Akas as they presented them with gifts and showed them gadgets. Jim Elliott got out a yo-yo, Nate played his harmonica, Ed blew up several balloons, and Pete showed them how to ping rubber bands. Roger presented them with a skein of red wool. George took control of it and quickly wound it around his body like a sash. Delilah made clicking noises and smiled at his new decoration. Nate and Pete waited as long as they possibly could before they flew out to Arahuno for the night. On the way, they wondered aloud what the 3 Akas would tell their fellow Akas about the day. As the evening wore on, the Aucas seemed happy to stay with the remaining 3 men. Jim Elliot gestured for them to spend the night sleeping by the fire. The offer seemed to please the older woman. However, Delilah didn't seem happy. She got up quickly and walked off into the jungle. She was gone as silently as she had arrived. George yelled after her, but she didn't turn around. After a couple of minutes, he shrugged his shoulders, stood up, and followed her into the jungle. Jim, Ed, and Roger waited for the older woman to do the same. Surely she wouldn't think it was safe for her to stay alone with the 3 coyote outsiders. To their surprise, she did stay, and when darkness had completely engulfed the jungle, she curled up beside the fire and went to sleep. As the 3 missionaries climbed the ironwood tree to bed, they were thrilled with how the day had gone. They had made friendly contact with the Aucas. Surely, they thought, the 3 Aucas would go back to their village and tell the others there was nothing to be afraid of, and the rest of the village would come to visit them on Palm Beach. What the Operation Auca men had no way of knowing at the time was why George and Delilah had come to their campsite in the first place. George and Delilah had wanted to marry, but Delilah's family did not like George and would not give them permission to marry. This had upset Delilah, who had told her family she would run away to the coyote, the outsiders, if they didn't change their minds about the wedding. Instead, her family laughed at her, so in a rage, she had set off through the jungle. George followed her, but in Auca culture, it is a very bad thing for an unmarried man and woman to be alone together, so the older woman had followed them to be their chaperone. They had all arrived at Palm Beach together, just as Delilah's desire to run away had petered out. They went ahead with the visit anyway, and they had an interesting time with the coyote, who turned out to be a strange bunch, but not dangerous. However, when first Delilah and then George left the campsite, the older woman had had enough of chasing after them, so she stayed on the beach and got a good night's sleep. In the morning, this created a problem for George, because he and Delilah had spent the night alone together. He had to think of a good excuse quickly, and he did. He decided to tell a lie that would change the course of countless lives. The next morning, when Jim, Roger, and Ed climbed down from their treehouse, the embers of the fire where the older woman had slept were still warm. They realized she must have stayed all night and fed the fire, but now she was nowhere to be seen. All day Saturday, the men waited for something to happen. Nate estimated it would take George and Delilah about 6 hours to walk back to the Auca village, if that was where they were headed. It would take them an hour or 2 to explain to the other Aucas what had happened when they visited the coyote, and then another 6 hours for a larger group to trek back to Palm Beach. But they did not come, and by 3 in the afternoon, Nate felt it was time for him and Pete to head back to Arahuno. First, though, he gathered up all the film from the cameras and letters the men had written to their wives. Whatever happened, they wanted the outside world to have a record of what they had done on Palm Beach. As they flew back, Nate and Pete couldn't help but be a little disappointed. Why hadn't the Aucas come back? After a good night's sleep, Nate felt a lot more hopeful. Something told him today was going to be a special day. On the way back to Palm Beach, Nate circled the Auca settlement to see whether there was any unusual activity going on, but there wasn't even any of the usual activity. The place seemed deserted. It was a great sign. Nate and Pete grinned at each other. Maybe the whole village was on its way down to the beach to meet them. Nate slowed the plane to about 65 miles per hour and skimmed along close above the thick vegetation. It was impossible to spot the Aucas through the dense canopy of trees, but Nate had to try. Pete strained his eyes, trying to peer through the treetops. Then, amazingly, they saw them. Wading across the stream ahead were 10 Aucas heading toward Palm Beach. Today really was the day when they would meet the whole Auca village. As the 2 men flew on to Palm Beach, Nate checked his watch. It was 12:30 p.m., time to call Marge on the radio and let her know how things were going. How excited she would be to know things were finally moving ahead. Nate told her they were expecting an Auca visit in the early afternoon and that he would report in with her at 4:30, though he knew she wouldn't leave the radio room all afternoon just in case they needed help. As the Piper Cruiser's wheels touched down on the sand of Palm Beach, Nate yelled to the others, "This is it, guys! They're on their way!" The men all let out a whoop of excitement. Their faith and patience were finally about to be rewarded.